Hello, on to Module 4, Collaboration and Alliances. Like last week, this is both a technique and a strategy. There's a strategic difference between being alliance and collaboration oriented versus being competitive. And the default setting for a lot of organisations is always competition, because of capitalism or whatever else, but it is often quite jarring to move into the public sector, which is supposed to be about serving the public. It's supposed to be not supposed to be about competing businesses, and seeing the same kind of competitive undermining behaviour and tactics that are used between corporations that are trying to drive each other out of business. It's always disappointing, particularly when there's a new injection of funds or money around a particular point. And I guess one of the outcomes of this particular module is to not only think about skills at being better at collaborating, but also to think about how much better strategically collaboration is, how less wasteful it is, and what better outcomes you get. But you tend to be fighting against a few things along the way, and one of them is individual egos, and people who tend to rise high in organisations tend to be very vested in their own careers and their own successes. That's a significant obstacle. And also this can be reflected in the actual structure of organisations. We have extremely hierarchical organisations. This tends to have a closed feedback loop around promoting into higher positions the kind of person who is competitive and career driven, and also pushing that kind of competitive behaviour. So we're going to talk a little bit more later in the course about concepts of leadership and concepts of organisations, structure within organisations. It's a tautology. But I just want to flag those things now, that sometimes the barriers to good strategy are built into the people and organisations that are supposed to be designing good strategy, that they are either deliberately or just through not thinking it through, creating poor strategy because of their orientation and their worldview. So it means if you have a chance, if you're ever in a position to make the kinds of decisions of people in your organisations, the way your organisation operates, you can do a lot with a little at the early stages by having a transparent, collaborative, cooperative model in what you do, and trying to stop those alpha personality types in dominating and taking over. Especially because they're not going to stick around for long anyway. They're going to come in, they're going to mess up your organisation, and then they're going to be jumping on to the next opportunity to take their career further. So or they just end up, or they're really bad at it and they end up stuck in your organisation, and you end up stuck with them long term. And I guess that happens a lot. You have these thwarted, business-minded types stuck in public organisations that can never get out because they're terrible at what they do, and no one wants them, but then you end up stuck with them. But again, that's a topic for another time, and we're going to talk about leadership and what that means in terms of strategy, and how we're not necessarily limited to this idea of leadership of the boss is the leader, and the person who's paid the most, who sits on top of the pyramid of the structure, is the leader. And a lot of successful organisations are moving far away from that, although a lot of very unsuccessful organisations are still very much stuck with that model of having an often incompetent person sitting at the top, bottlenecking all of the success that you're able to achieve. All right, so accepting that you might have, hoping you might have a better organisation, better culture, better people in your organisation, what does collaboration bring? And on page 3 of the study guide, the learning module for this week, there's a series of different factors, of different resources and assets that are better off shared. And I guess one of the things that ends up being a big price of competition is having to reproduce the same things over and over in every organisation, and everyone just having not enough money to have a full set of skills and resources and employees, but just replicating the same thing from division to division, and being able to streamline that to some extent, and being able to have, you know, a collaborative model where everyone takes care of one piece of the job, means you don't have to reproduce those things. There's also, I don't know if I spoke about it in the notes, but I included a picture of a wolf pack there, and there's been some very interesting material on the way in which wolf packs actually operate, because there's this mythology that wolf packs have alphas who are the leaders of the wolf packs, and they tell everyone else what to do, and everyone else is subservient to them. And that was done out of a set of methodologically flawed research that was done in a zoo in Germany, where all the wolves there were from different kinship groups. They didn't know each other. Many of them were suffering from PTSD from the you know, their background and how they ended up in captivity. And all these observations about the strongest wolves leading the weaker came from these zoo-based observations. And biologists who've been able to observe wolves in the wild have found a much more evenly spread competitive organisation structure amongst wolves. So it's one of those ironies that business people like to use, this is a wolf pack and I'm the boss because I'm the alpha wolf kind of thing. It's not true. It's not true about wolves, and it's not true about people either. So I probably should have explained the inclusion of that picture there, and maybe I do later on, I don't remember. Okay, let's have a chat about the reading for this week. There's some really good concepts that are built into that. They're talking about policing, but of course policing involves a lot of collaboration with lots of different public organisations, not just police and other police. The justice sector all has to come together around that policing job. So, as usual, I mean, these articles I think are all interesting reading, because I wouldn't have put them in there otherwise. And there's some important things to think about, and a lot of it I think is in the approach and the way in which the author Martin Knockelberg actually understands how organisations work. So he's Scandinavian, and that makes a big difference in organisational theory. And I think I saw a TED talk, it might have been from someone who was in Nokia, which is based in Finland, and they were saying, you know, how come Nokia works so well as an organisation, and people work really well together and cooperate within the organisation and within stakeholders. And the response was, well, we live in a very cold part of the world, and historically, if you didn't cooperate as a community, everyone died. And I thought that was an interesting observation, that some of the more extreme cultures that come from extreme environments, and it could be a hot environment as well, don't have the luxury of having multiple alphas contending over who gets to be the boss and wasting resources in that way. They have to develop a broader perspective. They have to develop this network perspective, and they have to come from a place of collaboration and cooperation, because that's historically, culturally, a crucial part of survival. And I do wonder sometimes whether the relatively mild environments of England, where predatory capitalism evolved, whether the relative luxury, the relative wealth, the much milder climates were some of the reasons why some of those bad behaviours had the opportunity to develop. We had the opportunity to be able to waste resources on, you know, executive pissing contests and corporations trying to serve the same market and drive each other out of business, because of their milder environment. I mean, obviously things are not that simplistic. There's a whole lot of historical factors apart from that, but I do think it is interesting that a lot of the cultures, a lot of the First Nations cultures in the world, where people live much more, I want to say, they might not necessarily live in harsher conditions, but they live in conditions where they don't have the opportunity to accrue a lot of surplus, tend to focus much more on those collaborative methods, and I think we can learn a lot from them. So there's a couple of concepts which I won't go to in detail here that are important from Knuckleberg's argument. First is brokerage, and how that connects into networks, and I think that's a very interesting thing to think about. And all of these concepts are relevant for the workshop this week, so please have a bit of a read before you come on to the workshop this week. And the other, and I'm not 100% sure on the pronunciation, is homophily. I'm going to go with homophily, which is about it's about similarity, and about the way in which organisations that are similar in various ways are best suited for collaboration. So I'll let you have a look at those concepts in more detail and what the article says about them. So it's much more than I can say here, but also think about the how those things are relevant in the context of the workshop for this week, which is about the fire problem in Blighton, and what do you need to do when you've got organisations who all have competing, sometimes overlapping roles, sometimes there are gaps in the roles. How can you use those concepts of network, brokerage and homophily to try and build an alliance structure? Okay. So this week, and I think the reading is a good example of this, I don't think there's anything stunning or that's a big revelation out of any of these materials. I didn't find that there was anything that shocked me, or I thought, well, that I hadn't thought of things that way. There was a bit in the last week's when we looked at, or the week before when we looked at public value. There was stuff there that I thought, oh, okay, I hadn't really thought about that. But a lot of this week has, I think, what's in common of a lot of business strategy reading is things that you read and you go, well, that makes sense. So that's not a discouragement from reading the material, because sometimes it is quite nice just to read through something and to go, yeah, well, that makes sense. Someone's actually organised stuff that I already kind of believed into a much more orderly list that I can then sort of use as a checklist if I'm in this situation and go, oh yeah, I need to make sure I do this, this and this. So it's not as exciting as when you hit something which opens your mind to new possibilities and new ways of thinking, but you can't do that every week. You burn out if you have your mind blown week from week. So I think a lot of the material this week does fall into that category of, yeah, it makes perfect sense, but it's good to have a resource to fall back on, and you'll have to fall back on in professional life, where if you hit this sort of scenario, you can go back to your notes and you can have a look and you go, oh yeah, okay, I'm in this position. This is the sort of things I need to think about. Now, at least early in your career, you're not going to be necessarily doing the formalization of alliances. That's going to be people higher up in organizations, but you might be doing some of the brokerage, or you might be identifying situations where there's a need for alliances and collaboration. And those things often happen to people who are at the entry level of an organization, because they're new and they see the problems with what longer term people have since grown accustomed to, and have grown used to this really inefficient way of doing things. And it often is new people who are in a position to go, hey, we could probably do this, and we could actually save ourselves a lot of time and effort and energy if we actually collaborated with this group and we did this as well. So things that, an common example is information. Organisations don't share information very well. They tend to share information about as well as they did in the pre-internet era, which is crazy given how easy it is to share information now. but for various reasons they tend to hang on to their sets of information. Quite often, as a member of an organisation, you can identify the need for the info, find out that someone else is holding it. You don't have to seek out the information all over again yourself, and actually push the organisation towards forming an alliance that will be mutually beneficial. So part 2 of the materials for this week looks at the different elements. It's a figure from one of the non-set readings. The arc of alliance strategy. It's one of these sort of diagrams that business types like. I do think it's quite useful because it looks at the different components of what you need to be able to do to form an alliance, the links between strategy and organisation, and one concept that comes out of that I think is particularly nice is the concept of an alliance constellation. And that is a way of thinking flexibly and fluidly about alliances and how they shift over time and in different situations. And as the reading points out, or my notes on the reading point out, too often people are locked into this hierarchical way of thinking of who's in charge and who's under them and who's manages these groups under that. And that's very limiting when it comes to building alliances, because you tend to then think in very fixed terms about, well, this is the group that does the community outreach, and this is the group that collects data and information, and this is what the relationship is. And what the article by Bamford et al. Suggests, well, it's a book. What it suggests is that things move too quickly to be able to purely see alliances between organisations in that kind of way. And sure, where there are interests involved and you have to have contracts. Now, usually you don't need contracts to have an alliance, but sometimes the consequences of alliances going wrong is significant enough that you'll want a contract between the groups. And if that happens, don't worry about it. That's going to be something for lawyers to sort out. But you have to be able to think beyond that. You have to be able to think really creatively about how those groups can share resources, share information, and collaborate as systems change. And the research of the authors of that book tended to find that alliances had this very limited lifespan, where there'd be a need and you get groups to come together and they'd form an alliance and they'd come in agreement, and by the time they'd actually formed some kind of formal agreement that was consistent with their very strict hierarchical way of operating, the need had gone or it had changed. And that's why alliances tend to drop off very quickly. They tend to have this brief enthusiasm between the organisations that drives the formation of the agreement, and formation tends to take much longer than it really should do. And then there's this sort of rapid drop off where people go, well, what are we doing with this alliance anyway? And anyway, the author suggested if you take all these things into account and you think in the form of a constellation of interests, that's actually a lot more productive for evolving and changing that relationship as time goes on. And we're going to come back to the Collingwood Neighbourhood Justice Centre, but I think the Neighbourhood Justice Centre is an excellent example of that, because they have built into their design that wiggle room for change and that wiggle room for understanding how things evolve. All right, nothing else. I mean, again, the rest of the materials this week I think are useful to you. I wouldn't put it down if they're not useful, but I don't think they're difficult, particularly challenging. Talking about strategies for maintaining alliances, things that can go wrong with alliances, and some of the digital tools you can use to enable collaboration. Although there's probably new ones that are have evolved and appeared since I wrote these notes. All right, so hopefully all this will come together in the workshop. Of course it will. It will come together in the workshop this week, where we will take a particular focus on the bushfires as an issue, and we will look at sites of organisational failure, historical organisational failure, and we'll try and find ways that we could use those concepts, particularly from Knockelberg's writing, to think about how do we go about negotiating a better model. All right, I will see you then.